Welcome to the debate. So today we're standing on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, conceptually speaking, of course. We're looking at a moment in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 through 34. And it's a scene that I think resonates just violently with anyone trying to balance a professional life with a spiritual one. The apostles have just come back from their mission. They are absolutely exhausted, and Jesus gives that famous invitation: come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while.
It might just be the most inviting sentence in the entire New Testament. It really speaks to a universal craving we all have. But as we know, the text just pivots immediately. They try to get away in the boat, but the crowd sees them, runs ahead on foot, and cuts them off. So when the boat lands, the lonely place is gone. It's a parking lot. It's just filled with people. And instead of, sending them away to get that rest, Jesus is moved with pity.
Right. And that tension, that pull between the divine command to rest and the crushing demand of the crowd, that's our subject today. We're going to frame this debate around a specific project. We want to construct the outline for a professional essay, stylized for a Latin American, specifically Mexican cultural context. And the goal of this essay is to synthesize the teachings of three doctors of the Church: St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, and St. John of the Cross, alongside St. Josemaría Escrivá.
That is a formidable lineup. And the central question we're trying to answer through this synthesis is this: how does a Christian reconcile the absolute necessity of contemplative withdrawal, that lonely place, with the immediate crushing demands of the apostolate? I'll be arguing for what I'm calling the primacy of withdrawal. My position is that without a distinct, prioritized separation from the world to fuel the soul, the work itself just becomes hollow. I'll be leaning pretty heavily on Augustine's theology of resting in God and St. John of the Cross's terrifying purification of the senses.
And for the purpose of this essay, I'll be arguing for the integration of action. I believe the text, and particularly the insights of St. Josemaría and St. John Chrysostom, they point us toward a different reality, that true rest and that lonely place are actually found within the work and even within the interruptions themselves.
To suggest the interruption is the rest. That's a bold claim. But okay, let's hear your position statement.
My position is really rooted in the reality of the incarnation. When we look at Mark 6, we see that compassion for the crowd actually supersedes the schedule for rest. But, more importantly, it transforms the very nature of that rest. And I want to draw immediately on St. Josemaría Escrivá, specifically from his letter 29. He writes with this immense practicality about the danger of what he calls angelism.
We should probably define that for listeners. It's a term that gets thrown around, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Sure. Angelism is the temptation to reject our physical reality. It's this idea that to be holy, we have to shed our humanity, our duties, our bodies, and just become pure spirits. It's the belief that the real spiritual life only happens when you aren't changing diapers or writing code or, sitting in traffic. Josemaría warns, we are not angels, we are men. He warns against trying to live a spirituality that rejects the prose of daily life.
But surely avoiding angelism doesn't mean we have to be completely consumed by activity. There's got to be a middle ground between being a disembodied spirit and, a hamster on a wheel.
Well, the middle ground is the integration. It means we don't look for a desert that's a physical escape from our duties. St. Josemaría argues that the work itself, if it's done with perfection and a supernatural motive, it becomes operatio Dei, the work of God, and actually cooperates in the redemption. If we're building this essay for a professional context, we have to look at St. John Chrysostom's homilies on Matthew. Chrysostom is very blunt. The shepherd has to forget his own comfort. In the source material, Chrysostom points out that the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, which comes right after this, it happens precisely because Jesus engages the crowd rather than dismissing them. The key phrase for me is they were like sheep without a shepherd. Active availability isn't a distraction from Christ, it's the highest imitation of him.
I appreciate the focus on availability, I really do. But I worry that this approach, if it's not carefully guarded, just leads to spiritual exhaustion and essentially a secularized activism
My position, the primacy of withdrawal, asserts that the invitation to come away and rest a while is a command. It is not a suggestion. We're finite creatures.
But aren't we fueled by the work itself if it's operatio Dei?
Only if the vessel is full. You can't pour from an empty cup. I mean, look at St. Augustine. In his Confessions, he famously declares, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." That rest isn't found in the many things of the crowd. It's found in the one. In City of God, Augustine distinguishes between holy leisure, atium sanctum, which seeks the truth, and necessary business, negotium, which is a duty of charity. But he places the priority on the truth-seeking. If the interior life, the Sabbath rest, is not strictly guarded, the exterior work rots. It's like the manna in the desert mentioned in Exodus. If you try to hoard the activity without that fresh, daily renewal of grace, it just breeds worms.
Do you think the integration of action risks hoarding activity?
I think it risks an idolatry of results. St. John of the Cross, in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, is terrifyingly precise about this. He speaks of the need to come to the marrow or fatness of the spirit. But to do that, one has to detach from the gustos.
Gustos? You mean the spiritual sweets?
Exactly. The tastes, the sensory pleasures of activity, even the pleasure of helping people. If we're addicted to the adrenaline of the crowd, we aren't serving God. We're feeding our own appetites. We feel important because we're busy. The lonely place is a necessary purification of the senses. So my thesis is that the key phrase is, come away by yourselves. Intimacy with God is the absolute prerequisite for any effective action. If you skip the come away, the go and teach just becomes noise.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. We have a tension between the interior cell and the marketplace. So let's move into the core debate. I want to challenge you on the nature of rest. You seem to define it as cessation, or at least withdrawal.
I define it as resistance. In the context of our proposed essay, we have to look at the Catechism's treatment of the third commandment, paragraphs 2184 through 2186. Link the Sabbath to God's own rest. It says, the institution of the Lord's Day contributes to everyone enjoying sufficient rest and leisure to cultivate their religious, social, and cultural lives. It is a protest against the servitude of work. If we don't stop, literally stop, we're essentially saying that our productivity is our God. Augustine's holy leisure isn't laziness, it's the active contemplation of the eternal. If we lose that, we lose our humanity.
I agree we have to avoid servitude to work, but I disagree with the definition of rest as merely stopping. St. Josemaría, in the source material about the spirit of Opus Dei, he offers a radical redefinition. Rest is not doing nothing. It is changing occupations.
Changing occupations? I mean, to the modern ear, that sounds like a recipe for burnout. It just sounds like more work.
It sounds like it, I know, but look at the theology behind it. If work is operatio Dei, as he says in letter 29, then the distinction between sacred rest and profane work, it blurs. My argument is that for the ordinary Christian, the target audience of our Mexican-style essay, the Sabbath heart has to exist on Monday morning. We can't have a split personality where we're holy on Sunday and secular on Tuesday. The sanctification of the activity is the rest, because it aligns the human will with the divine will. When you're doing exactly what God wants, even if it's strenuous, there is a rest of the soul. It's the difference between running a marathon because you love it and running away from a bear. One is exhausting but fulfilling, the other is just terror.
There is a peace in alignment, certainly. But rest in the biblical sense, the Sabbath sense, involves a cessation to acknowledge God's sovereignty. If you never stop changing occupations, you never purely receive. You're always outputting. You are always the protagonist. And this brings us right to the second point, the interruption, the crowd.
The crowd is the reality of life. You can't just theologize them away.
No, but St. John of the Cross would warn us that the crowd is also a temptation. He speaks of the gustos, the spiritual gluttony. There's a danger, which he references in his writings on the dark night and the purification of the spirit, of seeking satisfaction in the results of the work. If the apostles don't rest, they risk burning out, which is a modern term, sure, but the spiritual reality is ancient. They risk serving themselves under the guise of serving others. They need that lonely place to purify their intentions. If I am always available, always the hero of the interruption, am I serving God or am I serving my need to be needed?
That is a valid danger. Self-love is insidious. However, I want to counter with St. John Chrysostom. In his homilies on Matthew, specifically about this event and the feeding of the multitude, he notes that Jesus was moved to pity. He didn't say, "Come back later, it's my quiet time." The interruption was the will of God.
But Jesus is God. He has a union that we are striving for but do not possess.
But we are called to imitate him. St. Josemaría, in Furrow and the Way, he echoes this. He says, when you have to correct, do it with charity. He argues that annoyance at an interruption is often a sign of self-love, not zeal for God. If I get angry that my prayer time is interrupted by a crying child or a colleague in crisis, who am I really worshiping? My schedule or the God of charity?
This is where the stylistic element of our essay comes in. You mentioned the Latin American, Mexican context. How does that cultural lens shift the debate? Because a dry academic treatise isn't going to land the same way as something culturally rooted.
Well, just think about the culture. There's a profound value on hospitality, on the fiesta. In a Mexican context, if a guest arrives, you don't check your watch, you don't hand them a schedule. The interruption is the event.
So you're proposing a fiesta of availability.
Exactly. If we synthesize Chrysostom's emphasis on the shepherd's sacrifice with Escrivá's hatred of angelism, we can frame the interruption not as a breach of contract, but as a guest. Hospitality is a form of worship. The rest is found in the fiesta of serving the brother who has arrived. It recontextualizes the fatigue. It stops being an annoyance and starts being an encounter. You aren't losing time. You're gaining a brother.
That's compelling. It turns the interruption into a kind of sacrament of the neighbor. But I must insist, and this is my third point, that this hospitality is impossible to sustain without the internal cell. We cannot give what we do not have.
Go on.
St. Augustine is relentless on the need for the interior master. In the Confessions, he finds God not in the external world, not in the crowd, but by entering into his own depths. He needs to physically withdraw to hear the verbum, the word. The source material references 1 Kings, the whisper of God. The noise of the world, and yes, the noise of the crowd just drowns that out. If we don't physically withdraw, we lose the capacity to hear. We become echo chambers of the culture rather than voices of the word.
I agree on the silence, but I disagree on the location. We're looking at St. Catherine of Siena and St. Teresa of Avila in our sources. St. Catherine speaks of the house of self-knowledge, an interior cell. You can carry that cell with you. It's portable.
But is it as effective as actual physical silence? It's very easy to claim we are in our interior cell while we are actually just distracted by our phones.
St. Josemaría argues it has to be effective. He speaks of being contemplatives in the middle of the world. In Letter 29, he emphasizes that we are not to be taken out of the world. The lonely place is the heart in a state of grace. If you're walking in a busy city or navigating a chaotic office, if your heart is a tabernacle, to use his imagery, you are in the desert. You are in the lonely place even while shaking hands or signing contracts.
Contemplatives in the middle of the world. It is a beautiful ideal. But St. John of the Cross would ask, are your senses truly detached? Can you really walk through the market without the appetites latching on to everything? The physical withdrawal is a training ground. Without the training ground, the interior cell often has very thin walls. The noise gets in. The crowd of our own anxieties rushes in.
That leads us directly to the pastoral application. The essay we're outlining needs to answer a specific formative question. How does a Christian maintain a contemplative heart while being, frankly, eaten up by the demands of others? Because that is what happens to the apostles in Mark 6. They don't even have time to eat.
They are being consumed, literally. The gospel says they had no leisure even to eat.
My answer, drawing on the advocate position, is by turning the work into prayer. This is the concept of the offertory. If the work is operatio Dei,
then the fatigue, the stress, the interruption, it's all raw material to be placed on the altar. You don't escape the being eaten up. You consent to become bread, just as Christ did. You become Eucharist for the crowd.
That's a high mysticism. It sounds wonderful, but practically, for the average person, it can often devolve into just being busy and calling it holy. My answer, drawing on the dissenter position in St. Francis de Sales, who is referenced in our sources regarding the examination of the soul, is more structural. You maintain the contemplative heart by maintaining purity of intention.
And how do you ensure that purity?
Through rigorous examination, you have to step back, look at the work, and ask, did I do this for God or for me? Did I do this because I love them or because I wanted them to like me? You can't do that analysis while you're doing the work. You need the pause. You need the review.
So you're saying the pause protects the purity of the action.
Precisely. And the action validates the sincerity of the pause. If you pause and never act, you're lazy. If you act and never pause, you're an idolater.
Which brings us to a synthesis, I think. We're seeing that this isn't a binary choice between a cave and a marketplace.
No. It seems the essay we've outlined presents a paradox, which is fitting for a Catholic understanding. The Christian must seek solitude, as Jesus commanded in Mark 6:31, come away.
But must be willing to sacrifice that solitude for charity, as Jesus demonstrated in Mark 6:34, he had compassion on them.
You seek it to find him. You leave it to serve him.
So let's try to crystallize this into the 3 practical tips our Mexican professional essay would offer the reader. We need, Blinkist-level takeaways here. Based on our source material, what's the first takeaway?
Okay, the first takeaway has to come from the withdrawal side, grounded in St. John of the Cross and the Catechism section on prayer. We can call it the minute of the desert.
A fixed time?
Yes. St. John of the Cross speaks of the dark night and the stripping of senses. In a practical daily life, this means establishing a fixed time for mental prayer that is non-negotiable. It acts as the lonely place, even if it's just 15 minutes or half an hour. It is a boundary the crowd cannot cross. It's the one part of the day where you're unavailable to the world so you can be available to God. It creates a structural, lonely place.
I can agree to that, provided we have the second tip, which comes from the integration side. We'll call this sanctifying the interruption. This draws on St. Josemaría and Chrysostom.
How does that work in practice?
It's a mental pivot. When the crowd breaks in, whether that's a boss with a deadline, a child needing attention, or a crisis, you immediately make an act of faith. You say to yourself, this is the mission. It is not a distraction from my life with God. At this moment, it is my life with God. You turn the annoyance into an offering. You smile, not because it's fun, but because it's an act of mortification, as Escrivá suggests in The Way. You treat the interruption with the hospitality of the fiesta.
That requires immense discipline, but it is necessary. And the third tip? This one, I think, anchors both positions.
Sunday as the anchor. This is straight from the Catechism, paragraphs 2184 to 2186.
Yes, we must protect Sunday strictly, but not just as a day of not working. It has to be a day of gratitude.
Gratitude?
Doing things that have no economic value in a world obsessed with utility, wasting time with God and family is a radical act of resistance. It prevents work from becoming an idol. It reminds us that we are not just machines for the apostolates. We are children of the Father. If you don't anchor the week in Sunday, the week just drifts into chaos. It resets that occupational mindset you mentioned.
It is the ultimate lonely place shared by the whole community.
So, as we conclude our drafting of this theoretical essay, we're left with a composite image. We have St. Augustine's restless heart finding peace in the verbum. We have St. John of the Cross purifying our appetites so we don't consume the work for our own pleasure.
And we have St. John Chrysostom reminding us that the shepherd feeds the sheep even when he's tired, and St. Josemaría teaching us that the dusty road of the market is an altar if we walk it with love.
Seems we must be Martha and Mary's simultaneously. We can't choose.
We have to sit at his feet, and we have to serve the tables. And perhaps, as the advocate, I would say that serving the tables is sitting at his feet, if our eyes are open.
And I would add that we can only truly serve the tables if we have first sat at his feet and learned what to serve. We can only give to the crowd what we have received in the silence.
A fair point, and a challenge for all of us.
Indeed.
We will leave you with that question to ponder this week. Is your busyness a mission, or is it just an escape from the lonely place?
And is your rest a true Sabbath or just an escape from the crowd?
Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Until next time.